The generals called it suicide, a madman's fantasy, a plan so reckless it would cost thousands of lives and achieve nothing but slaughter. But on the morning of December 26, 1776, when the sun rose over Frozen River in New Jersey, the enemy fortress that had seemed impregnable just 12 hours earlier stood silent, captured, its garrison defeated. An entire course of failing revolution had reversed overnight. The man who conceived the plan, who'd pushed it through against every objection, who'd gambled everything on one impossible crossing, stood among the captured flags and watched his exhausted men collapse in the snow. His name was George Washington, and this night would prove that sometimes the difference between suicide and genius is nothing more than dawn. The autumn of 1776 had been a disaster. What had started as a bold declaration of independence in July had deteriorated into a long, humiliating retreat by December. Washington's Continental Army, once numbering over 20,000 men, had been reduced to fewer than 3,000 effective soldiers. The British had driven them out of New York, chased them across New Jersey, pushed them over the Delaware River into Pennsylvania. Every battle had been a defeat. Every retreat had cost men, supplies, and hope. The enlistments for most of Washington's remaining soldiers would expire on December 31st, just days away. After that, the Continental Army would simply cease to exist. The revolution would be over. The British knew it. The Loyalists were already preparing celebrations. Even Washington's own officers, the men who'd stood with him through the defeats, were beginning to accept the inevitable. The cause was lost. It was just a matter of time before Washington surrendered or his army dissolved. But Washington was looking at a map, studying a small town across the Delaware River, a place called Trenton, and he was thinking about something nobody else dared consider. One more attack, not a retreat, not a defensive stand, an offensive operation, in winter, against a fortified position, with an army that was starving, freezing, and on the edge of collapse. George Washington was 54 years old that December, and he'd spent the last 18 months learning a brutal education in defeat. Before the Revolution, he'd been a Virginia planter, a colonial militia officer with limited combat experience, a man of social standing but no real military genius. He'd been chosen to lead the Continental Army not because he was the best general available, but because he was from Virginia, because the Revolution needed Southern support, because he looked the part, tall and dignified in his uniform. The British professional officers had dismissed him as an amateur. They'd been right. His early campaigns had shown it. He didn't understand how to fight a European-style war against trained regulars. His tactics had been conventional, predictable, and ineffective. The British had outmaneuvered him repeatedly, but defeat is a teacher, and Washington had been paying attention. He'd learned that he couldn't beat the British in open battle. His men weren't trained for it. They broke under bayonet charges. They'd panicked under artillery. But he'd also learned something else. The British fought by rules. They had doctrine, procedure, expectations. They fortified positions. They went into winter quarters. They assumed their enemy would behave rationally, predictably, and Washington was beginning to understand that his only advantage, the only edge he had, was a willingness to do what no rational commander would attempt, to break the rules so completely that the British wouldn't see it coming until it was too late. Trenton was held by a brigade of Hessian soldiers, German mercenaries fighting for the British crown. About 1,500 men, under the command of Colonel Johann Rahl. They'd fortified the town, positioned artillery, established patrol patterns. They were professionals, experienced, well-equipped. They'd been celebrating Christmas, drinking, relaxing. Why not? The war was over. The rebels were finished. Winter had set in. Nobody fought in winter. The rivers were freezing. The roads were impassable. Washington's army was 25 miles away across an ice-choked river, dying slowly of cold and disease. There was no threat. Rahl had been warned by local loyalists that Washington might try something desperate, but he dismissed it. The Americans were beaten. They wouldn't dare attack a fortified position with their pathetic remnant of an army. It would be suicide. Every military professional in the British command agreed, which is exactly why Washington thought it might work. He'd called a council of war on December 23rd at his headquarters in Bucks County, Pennsylvania. His senior officers had gathered in a cold farmhouse, expecting another discussion about retreat, about where to fall back next, about how to preserve what little remained of the army. Instead, Washington had shown them a plan. They would cross the Delaware River on Christmas night, march 9 miles to Trenton, attack at dawn, capture the Hessian garrison before they could organize a defense, seize their supplies, weapons, and most importantly, prove that the Continental Army could still fight. The room had gone silent. Then the objections had started. General Horatio Gates had called it madness. The river was full of ice. The current was treacherous. They had barely enough boats. The men were exhausted, many without proper shoes, some literally leaving bloody footprints in the snow. A night march in winter storm conditions over 9 miles of frozen roads, maintaining complete silence, coordinating 3 separate crossing points, timing the attack for dawn. All of it had to work perfectly or the entire force would be destroyed. And even if they succeeded in crossing, they'd be attacking a fortified position held by professional soldiers who outnumbered them and had artillery support. It was suicide. Washington had listened to every objection. He'd nodded, acknowledged the risks. Then he'd said something that silenced the room. Necessity, not choice, compels us. If we do nothing, the army dissolves in 6 days. The revolution ends. We have one chance. We take it or we surrender. Those are the options. The decision wasn't unanimous, but it didn't need to be. Washington was commanding. The plan would proceed. But he knew the real battle wasn't tactical. It was psychological. His men were beaten down, demoralized, freezing, hungry. They'd retreated for months, lost every engagement, watched their friends die. They had every reason to believe this attack would just be another disaster, another defeat, the final one that would kill them all. Washington needed them to believe it was possible. Not likely, not safe, just possible. He spent the next 2 days visiting the camps, talking to the men, not making speeches, just being visible. He knew most of them by sight, remembered faces, asked about families. He didn't promise victory. He didn't try to inspire them with rhetoric. He just let them see that he wasn't giving up, that he still believed there was a chance. And slowly, reluctantly, some of that belief transferred. Not hope exactly, more like stubborn defiance. The willingness to try one more time because the alternative was going home defeated. And for men who'd already sacrificed so much, that was harder than risking death. December 25th, 1776. Christmas Day. The men spent it preparing equipment, checking weapons. Try to rest. Washington had ordered that the password for the operation would be victory or death. Not subtle, but clear. The officers understood what it meant. This wasn't a raid. It was a gamble. All or nothing. They would cross the river, attack Trenton, and either win decisively or be destroyed. There was no contingency for retreat. The boats couldn't make multiple trips. Once they crossed, they were committed. The plan called for 3 crossing points. Washington would lead the main force of 2,400 men across at McConkey's Ferry. 2 smaller forces would cross downriver to block Hessian escape routes and reinforce the attack. The entire operation depended on coordination, timing, and weather. They needed darkness to hide the crossing. They needed the Hessians to be unprepared. They needed luck. As the afternoon faded and evening approached, snow began to fall. Not gentle Christmas snow. A driving winter storm, wind-whipped and brutal. The temperature dropped. The river churned with ice floes. The officers looked at Washington. This was the moment to call it off. The conditions were impossible. Washington looked at the river, at the snow, at his shivering men. Then he gave the order. We cross tonight. The crossing began at sunset, around 6 in the evening. It should have taken 4 hours. It took 9. The storm intensified. The river was a chaos of ice and current. The boats, mostly Durham cargo vessels designed for transporting iron ore, were 40 to 60 feet long. But they weren't built for military operations and winter storms. The men had to pull and row against the current, while ice floes slammed into the hulls. Horses panicked. Artillery pieces nearly capsized boats. Men fell into the freezing water and had to be pulled out before hypothermia killed them. Washington stood on the Pennsylvania shore, watching, his face expressionless. Around him, officers were questioning whether they should continue. The two supporting forces downriver had already aborted their crossings. The ice was too thick. They couldn't make it. Washington's force was alone now. If they cross, they have no reinforcements, no blocking forces. The Hessians could escape or be reinforced. The tactical plan was already falling apart. Washington didn't react. He just kept sending boats across, one at a time, loading men, horses, artillery, sending them into the storm. By midnight, they were only halfway done. By 3 a.m, the last boat finally reached the New Jersey shore. They were 3 hours behind schedule. Dawn would come around 6. They had 9 miles to march. The element of surprise was already compromised. The march to Trenton was worse than the crossing. The roads were covered in snow and ice. Men slipped, fell, got up, kept moving. Many had no shoes. They wrapped their feet in rags. Blood marked the snow where they walked. The storm continued, wind driving sleet into their faces. They couldn't see more than a few yards ahead. Officers rode up and down the column, keeping the men together, preventing stragglers. Voices were kept to whispers. No fires, no rest stops, just march. The cold was so intense that some men's muskets froze. The flints wouldn't spark. Washington ordered them to fix bayonets. If their guns didn't work, they'd use steel. The column stretched out over 2 miles. Washington had divided his force into 2 groups that would attack Trenton from different directions, surrounding the town. Coordination was critical. Both forces had to arrive at the same time. But in the storm and the darkness, on unfrozen roads, timing was impossible. They were improvising now, hoping. Around 5:30 in the morning, with dawn approaching, the lead elements reached the outskirts of Trenton. They'd made it, exhausted, frozen, some of their weapons non-functional, hours behind schedule, but they'd made it. Ahead, in the pre-dawn darkness, they could see the lights of the town. The Hessians were still there, still asleep, still unaware. The Hessians had been warned. Local loyalists and British intelligence had reported that Washington might attempt something. Colonel Rahl had received multiple reports, but he dismissed them all. The storm had convinced him. Nobody would attack in this weather. His men were in their barracks, sleeping off Christmas celebrations. Sentries were posted, but they were cold, tired, focused on staying warm rather than watching empty roads. At exactly 6 o'clock, as dawn began to break, those sentries saw something that didn't make sense. Movement on the northern road. Lots of it. They raised their muskets, shouted challenges. Then the American artillery opened fire. 2 cannons, positioned at the head of the column, firing grape shot down the main street. The sentries disappeared. Alarm bells began ringing throughout Trenton. The Hessians stumbled out of their barracks, confused, half-dressed, grabbing weapons. Their officers were shouting orders, trying to form defensive lines. But the Americans were already in the town, coming from 2 directions, musket fire and artillery raking the streets. The Hessians tried to deploy their own artillery, but American riflemen were targeting the gun crews. One by one, the Hessian cannons were captured. Colonel Rahl, awakened by the chaos, tried to organize a counterattack. He led his men into the street, attempting to retake the artillery positions. An American musket ball hit him in the side. He fell from his horse. His men carried him to a nearby building. The Hessian defense collapsed. The battle lasted 90 minutes. It wasn't a battle in the conventional sense. It was an overwhelming assault on a surprise garrison. The Hessians fought bravely, tried to form defensive positions, attempted to counterattack. But they were surrounded, outnumbered, and their commander was dying. Groups of Hessians tried to escape across the creek south of town. American units were already there, cutting off the retreat. Others barricaded themselves in buildings and tried to hold out. American artillery fired directly into the structures at close range. By 8 o'clock, it was over. The Hessian officers were offering surrender. Over 900 enemy soldiers laid down their weapons. 22 Hessians were dead, 98 wounded. The American casualties were 4 wounded, 2 of them from frostbite rather than combat. 0 dead. 0. The impossible attack. The suicide mission that every professional military officer had said would fail had succeeded with almost no American losses. Washington stood in the center of Trenton, surrounded by captured flags, piles of enemy weapons, and his own men who were staring at each other in disbelief. They'd won. Actually won. Not a desperate holding action. Not a strategic retreat. An actual victory. But Washington knew the real danger was just beginning. The British garrison at Princeton, 6 miles away, would have heard the artillery. Reinforcements would be coming. His men were exhausted. Many could barely stand. The captured Hessians needed to be guarded. The supplies needed to be collected. And they still had to cross back over the Delaware River, which was even more ice-choked now than it had been the night before. Washington gave his officers 30 minutes to organize the withdrawal. Captured weapons, ammunition, supplies, and prisoners were loaded onto wagons. The wounded were carried. Then the entire force began moving back toward the river. The march back was slower. Men were collapsing from exhaustion. Officers had to physically lift soldiers and push them forward. But discipline held. The column stayed together. By late afternoon, they'd reached the crossing point. The boats were still there. They began loading. Prisoners first, then supplies, then the men. The British arrived at Trenton 3 hours later. They found an empty town, captured cannons, dead Hessians, and no sign of the American force except bloody footprints leading north. Washington and his entire army were already on the Pennsylvania side of the Delaware, unreachable. The British stood on the shore and watched the far bank. They'd been outmaneuvered completely. The impact of the Trenton victory was immediate and profound. News spread to the colonies within days. The Continental Army had won, not just survived, won decisively against professional European soldiers. In winter, in a storm, the psychological effect was devastating to British morale and transformative for American morale. Militia units that had disbanded began reforming. Men whose enlistments had expired re-enlisted. New recruits arrived. Washington's army, which had been 3,000 starving men on December 25th, swelled over 6,000 by mid-January. The British, who'd been planning victory celebrations, were now forced to pull back their forward positions, consolidate their defenses, and rethink their entire strategy. If Washington could do this in December, what would he do in spring? The psychological advantage had shifted. Suddenly, the British were the ones looking over their shoulders. Washington, the amateur general who'd lost every major battle, had proven that unconventional thinking could defeat conventional superiority. He'd broken the rules so completely that the rule followers hadn't known how to respond until it was too late. The British High Command conducted an investigation. How had this happened? How had a defeated rebel army crossed an ice-choked river in a winter storm, marched 9 miles undetected, and overwhelmed a fortified garrison? The reports focus on Rawls' negligence, his dismissal of warnings, his overconfidence. But the deeper problem was doctrinal. The British fought by the rules of 18th century European warfare. You didn't attack in winter. You didn't cross rivers at night. You didn't march exhausted men through storms. You didn't assault fortified positions with inferior forces. Washington had violated every principle of conventional warfare, and because he'd violated all of them at once, the British hadn't prepared for it. They'd assumed their enemy would behave rationally. They'd been wrong. And that assumption cost them not just a garrison, but the war's momentum. After Trenton, the revolution was no longer a dying rebellion. It was a viable resistance. European powers began paying attention. France started considering official support. The British realized they weren't fighting a conventional war against a conventional enemy. They were fighting something more dangerous, an opponent willing to accept risks that no professional military would consider. Washington himself never called Trenton a tactical masterpiece. In his official reports, he described it as a necessary gamble, executed successfully due to the courage of his men and the advantage of surprise. He didn't claim genius. He didn't celebrate his strategic vision. In fact, he was more critical than celebratory. The operation hadn't gone according to plan. The two supporting forces had failed to cross. The march had taken too long. The coordination had been imperfect. In a professional military analysis, Trenton had been a flawed operation saved by enemy incompetence and favorable luck. But Washington understood something his critics didn't. Perfect execution wasn't the goal. Victory was. And sometimes victory required accepting imperfection, embracing chaos, and trusting that aggression and surprise could compensate for tactical weakness. The generals who called his plan suicide had been thinking in terms of military theory. Washington had been thinking in terms of reality. Theory said the operation was impossible. Reality said they had no other choice. And when there's no other choice, impossible becomes irrelevant. The days following Trenton brought another decision point. Washington had proven the army could still fight, but the British were regrouping. A large force under General Cornwallis was marching toward Trenton to trap Washington against the Delaware River and destroy his army once and for all. Washington's officers expected him to retreat back across the river, to consolidate the victory and avoid risking everything in another engagement. But Washington looked at the map again. Cornwallis was in Trenton. The British garrison at Princeton, behind Cornwallis, was now isolated, lightly defended. If Washington could slip around Cornwallis during the night, march north, and hit Princeton before the British realized what was happening, he could win another victory and force the British to abandon their forward positions entirely. The officers stared at him. They just executed one impossible night march. He was proposing another, in worse conditions, against an alerted enemy. The response was predictable. It's too risky. We've already won. Don't gamble the victory. Washington listened. Then he gave the order. We march tonight. The night march to Princeton on January 2nd, 1777, was even harder than the Trenton March. The roads were worse. The men were more exhausted. But this time they believed. They'd done the impossible once. They could do it again. Washington led the army on a back road that bypassed Cornwallis entirely. The British had no idea the American army had moved until dawn, when they heard artillery fire from Princeton. By the time Cornwallis realized what had happened and marched north, the battle was over. Washington had defeated the Princeton garrison, captured more supplies, and was already withdrawing to the hills around Morristown, where the terrain favored defense. In 10 days, Washington had executed 2 surprise attacks, defeated 3 enemy garrisons, captured thousands of weapons and tons of supplies, revitalized the revolution, and forced the British to abandon most of New Jersey. The generals who called the plan suicide were now calling it brilliant. But nothing about the plan had changed, just the outcome, which is a lesson Washington had learned. Success redefines risk. What looks like suicide before victory looks like genius after. The difference isn't the plan. It's the willingness to execute it when everyone else says it's impossible. The strategic impact of Trenton and Princeton extended far beyond the immediate tactical victories. Before December 1776, the European powers viewed the American Revolution as a doomed colonial uprising, not worth supporting. After Trenton and Princeton, France began serious negotiations for an alliance. Spain reconsidered its neutrality. The Dutch started providing covert aid. Washington's willingness to take risks that professional militaries wouldn't take demonstrated that the Americans were serious, capable, and unpredictable. That unpredictability became America's strategic advantage. The British never knew what Washington would do next because he didn't follow the rules they expected. He attacked when he should have retreated. He took risks when he should have consolidated. He gambled when he should have played it safe. And enough of those gambles succeeded that the British could never establish the control they needed. They won battles, held cities, had superior forces, but they couldn't defeat an enemy who refused to fight the way wars were supposed to be fought. Modern military historians study Trenton as a case study in unconventional warfare. The operation violated virtually every principle of military science as existed in the 18th century. The force was too small. The objective was too ambitious. The conditions were too severe. The risks were too high. By every standard analysis, the attack should have failed catastrophically. But Washington understood something that military science often misses. The enemy is also making assumptions. They're also following doctrine. They're also constrained by what they think is possible. And if you can act outside their framework of possibility, you gain an advantage that no amount of tactical superiority can counter. The Hessians at Trenton were better trained, better equipped, and better positioned than the Americans. But they were also operating within a mental framework that said nobody attacks in winter storms. That framework was their vulnerability. Washington exploited it not through superior tactics, but through willingness to do what nobody expected. The personal cost of Washington is harder to measure. He spent the winter of 1776 watching his army disintegrate, knowing that every defeat brought the revolution closer to collapse. He received letters from Congress questioning his leadership. He faced mutiny threats from unpaid soldiers. He watched men desert, die of disease, freeze to death in inadequate camps. The decision to attack Trenton wasn't made from a position of strength. It was made from desperation. But Washington never let his men see the desperation. He maintained absolute composure, absolute confidence in their presence. Only his personal correspondence reveals the doubt, the fear, the awareness of how close the entire revolution came to ending. In a letter to his brother written in December, before the Trenton operation, Washington admitted he didn't know if the cause could be saved. But he also wrote that giving up without trying was worse than trying and failing. That calculus, that willingness to risk failure rather than accept defeat by default, was what separated Washington from more cautious commanders. He understood that sometimes the worst decision is a safe decision. The men who crossed the Delaware River that Christmas night carried a memory for the rest of their lives. In pension applications filed decades later, veterans describe the crossing, the march, the battle. Their accounts are remarkably consistent. They remember the cold, the ice, the blood on the snow. They remember being convinced they were going to die, but going anyway because Washington asked them to. They remember the moment when the Hessians surrendered and they realized they'd won. Many described it as the moment they started believing the revolution could actually succeed. Before Trenton, they were just trying to survive. After Trenton, they were fighting to win. That psychological transformation was Washington's real achievement, not the tactical victory, but the restoration of belief. He'd taken beaten, demoralized men and shown them they could defeat professional soldiers if they were willing to take risks and endure hardship. That lesson carried them through the rest of the war. The Hessian prisoners captured at Trenton were treated well by American standards. Washington ordered that they be given food, medical care, and respect. Many were surprised. They'd been told the Americans were savages who would torture and murder prisoners. Instead, they were treated as soldiers. Some eventually joined the Continental Army. Others settled in America after the war. The psychological warfare aspect of this was deliberate. Washington wanted the British and their allies to see that Americans fought with honor, that they could be brutal in battle but humane in victory. This treatment of prisoners became a strategic asset. It made other Hessian units less willing to fight to the death. It encouraged desertion. It undermined the British narrative that the Americans were lawless rebels. Washington understood that how you win matters almost as much as winning. Trenton could have been a massacre. Instead, it was a decisive victory followed by honorable treatment of the defeated. That combination sent a message to the world. America was fighting for something worth respecting. The British spent years trying to counter Washington's unconventional approach. They increased their intelligence gathering. They fortified winter quarters. They prepared for surprise attacks. But preparing for surprise attacks from an unpredictable enemy is nearly impossible. The British couldn't defend everywhere. They couldn't maintain maximum alertness constantly. And Washington had learned that he didn't need to win every battle. He just needed to win the battles that mattered, at moments when the psychological impact would be maximum. Trenton mattered because it came at the darkest moment of the revolution, when morale was lowest and defeat seemed inevitable. The victory reversed the psychological trajectory. It didn't end the war. The fighting would continue for 7 more years. But it changed the nature of the conflict from British oppression of a failed rebellion to British struggle against a viable opponent. That change was irreversible. There's a famous painting of Washington crossing the Delaware, created by Emanuel Leutze in 1851, 75 years after the event. It shows Washington standing heroically in a boat, flag waving, men rowing through ice, dawn light breaking. It's dramatic. It's inspiring. It's also completely inaccurate. Washington wouldn't have stood in a boat in those conditions. He'd have been sitting. The crossing happened at night, not dawn. The flag shown didn't exist in 1776. But the painting captures something true even if the details are wrong. It captures the audacity, the defiance, the refusal to accept defeat. Washington did cross that river when everyone said it was impossible. He did attack when he should have retreated. He did win when he should have lost. The painting isn't historical documentation. It's mythologization. But sometimes myths carry truth that facts can't convey. The truth is that sometimes the difference between a doomed cause and a successful revolution is one man willing to try what everyone else calls suicide. The lesson of Trenton isn't that reckless risk-taking always succeeds. Most of the time, it fails. Most of the time, the generals who call a plan suicide are correct. Trenton worked because Washington understood the difference between stupid risk and calculated risk. Stupid risk is gambling without understanding the odds. Calculated risk is gambling when you stack the deck as much as possible and accepted that failure is probable but success is possible. Washington didn't just throw his army at Trenton, hoping for the best. He studied the terrain. He timed the attack for maximum surprise. He chose an objective that was strategically valuable but tactically vulnerable. He prepared his men as well as conditions allowed. Then, after doing everything possible to improve the odds, he accepted the risk that remained. That's the difference. Preparation doesn't eliminate risk. It makes risk worth taking. And sometimes, in desperate circumstances, a 50% chance of success is better than a 100% certainty of slow defeat. The modern military still teaches Trenton, not as a tactical model to replicate, but as a case study in crisis decision-making, when conventional approaches have failed, when resources are limited, when time is running out, how you decide what risks are worth taking. The answer Washington demonstrated is that you assess not just the risk of action, but the risk of inaction. Doing nothing guarantees the current trajectory continues. If that trajectory leads to failure, then doing something risky is actually the safer choice. This calculus applies beyond military strategy. It applies to any situation where the status quo is unacceptable and the safe options have already failed. In those moments, the question isn't whether to take risks. It's which risks give you the best chance to change the outcome. Washington chose to risk his army on one winter night, rather than watch it dissolve over 6 winter days. The second option felt safer, because it was passive. But passive defeat is still defeat. Active risk at least offered a chance. Washington never wrote a memoir. He never gave interviews about Trenton. He recorded the basic facts in official reports. But he didn't reflect publicly on the decision-making process, the doubts, the fears. We know from his correspondence that he understood how close the gamble came to failing. We know he credited luck and divine providence as much as planning. We know he never stopped second-guessing his decisions, even the successful ones. That self-doubt, paradoxically, may have been one of his strengths. Commanders who are certain they're right often make catastrophic mistakes because they ignore contrary evidence. Commanders who doubt themselves constantly reassess, adapt, and change course when needed. Washington's uncertainty made him flexible. He proposed plans, listened to objections, modified when it made sense, but ultimately decided and committed. That balance between doubt and decisiveness is rare. Most leaders fall to one extreme or the other. Washington lived in the tension between them. The revolution continued for 7 years after Trenton. There were more defeats, more retreats, more moments when the cause seemed lost. But there was never again a moment when the Continental Army seemed about to dissolve entirely. Trenton established that they could survive, could win, could endure. Every time British commanders thought they'd finally cornered Washington, he'd find a way out, not always through victory. Sometimes through retreat, evasion, survival, but he kept the army intact. And as long as the army existed, the revolution existed. The British eventually gave up not because they were defeated militarily, but because they couldn't achieve a final victory. They couldn't force Washington into a decisive battle where their superior forces would overwhelm him. And they couldn't occupy enough territory to suppress the rebellion while an active Continental Army remained in the field. Washington won the war not by winning battles, but by refusing to lose the war. That strategy started at Trenton, when he proved that refusing to lose was possible even when everyone said it wasn't. In 1789, 13 years after Trenton, George Washington became the first president of the United States. The man who gambled everything on one winter night now led the nation that gamble had helped create. But he never forgot how close it came to failing. In his first inaugural address, he spoke about providence, about unexpected turns in human events, about outcomes that seemed impossible until they happened. He didn't mention Trenton specifically. He didn't need to. Everyone listening remembered. They remembered the winter when the revolution was dying. They remembered the general who refused to accept defeat. They remembered the night when a suicide mission became a turning point. Washington's presidency was marked by the same calculated risk-taking he'd shown at Trenton. He established precedents, knowing future presidents might abuse them. He expanded executive authority, knowing it could lead to tyranny. He took risks because the alternative, letting the young nation drift without strong leadership, seemed more dangerous. Not everyone agreed with his choices, but everyone understood his calculus. Sometimes doing nothing is the riskiest option. George Washington died in 1799, 23 years after crossing the Delaware. In his final years, he rarely spoke about the war, but Mount Vernon, his Virginia estate, displayed captured Hessian flags from Trenton in the main hall. Visitors would see them and ask about the battle. Washington's responses were brief, factual, and deflective. He'd credit his officers, his men, divine providence, luck, never himself. But the flag stayed on the wall. He kept them there for a reason, not as trophies, as reminders. Reminders that impossible doesn't mean unachievable. That when everyone says a plan can't work, sometimes they're right, but sometimes they're just afraid. That the difference between a hero and a fool is often nothing more than whether the gamble succeeds. And that the men who change history are usually the ones willing to be called fools if they're wrong, because they decided that some things are worth risking everything to achieve. The generals called it suicide. They were probably right. By every rational analysis, crossing the Delaware in a winter storm to attack a fortified garrison with an exhausted, under-equipped army was suicidal. The plan violated doctrine, ignored tactical limitations, and depended on factors Washington couldn't control. But Washington understood something the generals didn't. When you're losing, when the clock is running out, when conventional wisdom says you're finished, rational analysis becomes irrelevant. You're not choosing between a good plan and a bad plan. You're choosing between a desperate plan and certain defeat. And when those are your options, desperate starts looking reasonable. That's what Washington bet on. Not that the plan would work, but that trying something impossible was better than accepting the inevitable. And on one frozen Christmas night in 1776, that bet paid off. The battle ended overnight. The revolution survived. And the man they called suicidal became the father of a nation. Because sometimes the difference between madness and genius is just one crossing, one march, one dawn. Subscribe for more stories like this.